My name is Dylan Borland, a former 1N1 geospatial intelligence specialist for the United States Air Force in an active duty enlisted capacity from 2010 to 2013. I'm a federal whistleblower, having testified to both the ICIG and ARROW with direct firsthand knowledge of and experience with crafting technologies that are not ours and are reportedly operating without congressional oversight. Because of my direct knowledge of the reality of certain legacy UAP programs, my professional career was deliberately obstructed. During the summer of 2012, my team was on standby for weather and I returned to my barracks on base, and at approximately 0130, I saw an approximately 100-foot equilateral triangle take off from near the NASA hangar on the base.
And they counted between 35 and 40 infant and juvenile Bigfoot prints.
What I can tell you right now is you're telling me things that you can't find on YouTube or you can't find on any books. You have to be a researcher in the field to know certain things that are not out there, and you're hitting all the things that are not out there. I can tell you right now, you're not crazy. And she goes, yeah, you're legit a generational abductee.
In the middle of the woods at the moment.
Yes, sir. I'm familiar with the area.
What the?
What was that, sir?
That's not human! That's not human!
Sir, are you okay, sir?
There's something in the back of my truck!
I have confirmed on the record that Robert Bigelow and a trusted colleague from USAF met with and negotiated with senior executives at Lockheed Martin and hammered out a deal wherein Bigelow's company, Bass, would receive a quantity of unusual material that had been stashed away and protected at a facility in California. That material was not made here.
You know, there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with working in a field that most people think is a joke. You're sitting in a government office, you have a title, you have a desk, you have a filing cabinet full of documents that other people laughed at before they handed them to you. And your job, your actual government-issued job, is to figure out what's up there. That was Nick Pope's life for 3 years at the British Ministry of Defense. And what he did with those 3 years and the 30 years that followed changed the conversation around unidentified aerial phenomena forever. Nick Pope died on April 6, 2026, at his home in Tucson, Arizona. He was 60 years old. He had been diagnosed with stage 4 esophageal cancer just 8 weeks earlier. And in the weeks before that diagnosis and his death, he kept giving interviews. He kept showing up. He never stopped being the voice he had always been. Today's episode is for him. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Monica, and today we're doing something a little different. This is a tribute episode, a deep dive into the life and work of one of the most important figures in the history of UFO and UAP research. And I want to be careful about how I say that, because Nick Pope himself would have been the first to push back on anything too sensational. He was precise, he was measured. He built his credibility on the fact that he didn't overreach, and that made everything he did say land with enormous weight. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so walking through 6 of the most pivotal pillars of his body of work: his landmark books, his documentary contributions, his speeches, and op-eds, and the quieter, behind-the-scenes ways he helped move an entire subject from the fringe into the halls of power. By the end of this episode, I hope you'll understand not just what Nick Pope did, but why it mattered and why it still does. Let's get into it. So, the book that started it all was called Open Skies, Closed Minds. It was published in 1996. If you want to understand Nick Pope, you have to start here. In 1991, Pope was a career civil servant at the UK Ministry of Defense, young, pragmatic, skeptical by nature. He had been working in Air Force operations when he was reassigned to a department he'd never heard of. It was called, formerly, the Secretariat Air Staff 2A. Everyone else called it the UFO desk, and he was the only person staffing it. His colleagues teased him. They'd whistle the theme from Close Encounters of the Third Kind when he walked by. They called him Spooky. He laughed it off and got to work. For 3 years, Nick Pope did something almost no one else on the planet was doing in an official government capacity. He took UFO sightings seriously. He interviewed witnesses, he cross-referenced radar data, he filled reports. He tried to figure out whether any of it represented a genuine threat to national security. And in the process, something happened that he hadn't planned for. He started to believe. In 1996, shortly after leaving the UFO desk, but while still employed by the Ministry of Defense, Pope published Open Skies, Closed Minds. The subtitle said it all. For the first time, a government UFO expert speaks out. This was genuinely unprecedented. The book had to go through official government clearance before publication. The MOD signed off on it, not as an endorsement, but because Pope had been careful enough, rigorous enough, and credible enough that they couldn't stop him. And that restraint is exactly what made the book so powerful. He wasn't screaming from the rooftops. He wasn't selling a conspiracy. He was a civil servant, writing in the measured tones of a man who'd spent 3 years looking at the data and telling the public, something is happening, and your government is not taking it seriously enough. It became a bestseller in Britain almost immediately. The book touched on everything Pope investigated during his tenure: UFO sightings, crop circles, cattle mutilations, close encounter reports. And he made a case that roughly 20% of the sightings his office received simply could not be explained away by conventional means. What's worth noting, and worth saying out loud in a tribute like this, is that Pope later distanced himself from some of the more dramatic conclusions in this first book. He had initially argued that an alien race might be waging a secret, hostile campaign against humanity. As the years went on, he pulled back from that framing. He was willing to be wrong. He was willing to revise. And that intellectual honesty became one of the hallmarks of his entire career. Open Skies, Closed Minds wasn't just a book. It was the opening of a door that Nick Pope would spend the rest of his life holding open for the rest of us. 1 year after his debut, Pope published a book that often gets overshadowed by his more famous work, and I think that's a mistake because in a lot of ways, The Uninvited shows a different side of him entirely. Where Open Skies, Closed Minds was about policy and national security, The Uninvited was about people. We're talking about The Uninvited in 1997, The Human Cost of the Unknown. The book is a deep, careful investigation into the alien abduction phenomena. And before you roll your eyes, I'd ask you to hold on for a second, because that's exactly the kind of reaction Nick Pope was fighting against his entire career. He wasn't asking you to believe, he was asking you to look. What he found, when he looked, was a population of people from all walks of life, national, functioning people, who described encounters that followed remarkably consistent patterns across cultures, countries, across decades, missing time, physical sensations, beings, a feeling of profound significance that they couldn't shake. Pope approached all of it with what Publishers Weekly described as the understated authority a reader would expect from the man who acted as the official investigator into UFO sightings for the British Ministry of Defense. He wasn't credulous, he was curious. He dug into the folklore roots of these experiences, traced the history of the contactee movement, and placed modern claims within a much longer human tradition of encounters with something other. What makes this book important beyond its content is what it reveals about Nick Pope as a person. He genuinely cared about the experiencers, the people who came to him with these stories. He didn't mock them, didn't exploit them. He treated them with the same rigor and the same respect he would have given to any witness in any other context. That empathy, that basic human decency toward people whose stories made them vulnerable to ridicule, was a thread that ran through everything he did. The Uninvited reminds us that behind all the policy debates and the national security framing, there were real human beings at the center of these encounters, and Nick Pope never lost sight of that. When fiction became the only safe language, Operation Thunderchild and Operation Lightning Strike. There's a famous tagline attached to Nick Pope's science fiction novels, and I think it's one of the most quietly extraordinary things he ever said publicly. The tagline was this: "The truth can only be told in fiction." Let that sit for a second. Operation Thunderchild and its sequel, Operation Lightning Strike, were published in the late 1990s and read on the surface as high-octane alien invasion thrillers. Pope brought his insider knowledge of UK military strategy, defense policy, and government decision-making to the stories. They were gripping. They were technically detailed in a way that only someone with real access could pull off. But the reason people in the UFO community paid close attention, and still do, is what happened before the books were published. The manuscripts went through the government's official security clearance procedure. These were novels, works of fiction, and they still had to be vetted by the MOD before they could be printed, which raises a question Pope never fully answered, and perhaps never could. What exactly were they checking for? Pope never claimed the books were a direct data dump of classified information, but he chose that tagline deliberately. He was a precise man, a government man, and he did not use words carelessly. When he said the truth could only be told in fiction, he was inviting the reader to pay attention to the fiction. For the serious student of his work, these novels are fascinating artifacts. They sit at the intersection of what we knew, what he could say, and what he could only gesture toward. There's something almost poignant about a man who spent 3 years reading classified UFO files, choosing to write science fiction as a release valve. It tells you something about the constraints he operated under and about the things that stayed with him long after he left that desk. Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, 2014. The British Roswell. If you follow UAP research at all, you know about Rendlesham Forest. If you don't, let me give you the short version. In December of 1980, something landed near 2 of NATO's most strategically critical military bases in Suffolk, England. It was tracked on military radar. Multiple military personnel, U.S. Air Force servicemen stationed at RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge approached the object. Some of them touched it. They described structured craft, strange lights, and markings on the hull. One officer, Jim Peniston, reportedly made a detailed sketch in his notebook at the scene. The incident lasted over several nights. It was witnessed by multiple people with military training, and for over 3 decades, it was largely suppressed. In 2014, Nick Pope co-wrote Encounter in Rendlesham Forest with 2 of the men at the heart of that night, Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston and Airman John Burroughs, both retired from the United States Air Force. Pope used his contacts, his credibility, and his experience navigating Freedom of Information requests, FOIA requests, to pull out documents that had never been seen publicly. The book hit #1 on Amazon's UFO chart. Reviewers called it simply the most well-documented UFO incident ever. What set this book apart from so much of the literature in this space was the architecture of evidence underneath it. Pope wasn't just retelling a compelling story, he was building a case, the way an investigator builds a case, with documents, witness testimony, and a clear, transparent methodology. He was also keenly aware of the historical significance of what he was doing. Rendlesham had long been considered Britain's Roswell, a shorthand that Pope both used and complicated. Because in some ways, Rendlesham was better documented than Roswell. The witnesses were alive, they were named, they had ranks and service records, and they were willing to go on record. There's a moment that's worth pausing here. John Burroughs, one of the co-authors, had spent years fighting the U.S. government for access to his own medical records, records he believed documented radiation injuries he sustained during the incident. Pope helped him win that battle. He used his platform and his connections to draw attention to Burroughs' case, and eventually the records were released. That's not just research, that's advocacy. And that's a man using everything he built, the credibility, the access, the platform, in the service of someone who needed help. That's who Nick Pope was. Enter Ancient Aliens, UFOs Declassified, and Hollywood, the mainstream translator. Let me say something that might be a little controversial, and then I'll explain myself. Nick Pope's television work, especially Ancient Aliens, was in some ways his most important contribution to the field. I know. Ancient Aliens is not exactly known for its rigorous sourcing. It's sensational, dramatic, it leans hard into speculation. And Pope, who was precise and careful in his written work, occasionally found himself on screen alongside theories he probably didn't entirely endorse. But here's the thing, that show reached tens of millions of people. Pope appeared in nearly 100 episodes of Ancient Aliens over the course of its run. He moderated live tour events, conferences. He was the credible anchor in a sea of speculation. The one guest who can stand in front of a camera, reference his government background, and make people at home think, okay, maybe this isn't entirely crazy. And that mattered enormously, because the single greatest barrier to mainstream engagement with UFO and UAP research wasn't a lack of evidence, it was stigma. It was the cultural reflex that filed the whole subject under kooks and tinfoil hats. Nick Pope spent his entire post-MOD career chipping away at that stigma. Every time he appeared on screen, whether it was Ancient Aliens, UFOs Declassified on the Smithsonian Channel, Good Morning America, Tucker Carlson Tonight, or any of the dozens of other programs he contributed to, he was doing the same thing, standing in the room and refusing to be embarrassed. He also contributed as a consultant and spokesperson to major Hollywood films, including War of the Worlds, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and Alien Covenant. These weren't vanity projects. Pope understood that popular culture shapes public perception, and that getting the details right in a blockbuster, getting filmmakers to treat the subject with some degree of seriousness, was another form of education. He also hosted The Basement Office on the New York Post YouTube channel, a series that covered UAP research in depth, in conversation with some of the most serious journalists and researchers in the field. It was a different register from Ancient Aliens, more forensic, more grounded, and it showed the range of what he could do. The point is this: Nick Pope understood that credibility is a tool, and he used this strategically, deliberately, effectively to pull an entire subject into the light. Speeches, op-eds, and the disclosure crusade. He used a platform to change the world. The last pillar of Nick Pope's work is also the one that I think history will judge most favorably. Because the books were important and the television work reached millions of people, but the speeches and the op-eds and the relentless public advocacy, that was where Nick Pope tried to change policy. Let's talk about the rooms he was in. He spoke at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. He spoke at the Royal Albert Hall. He addressed the Global Competitiveness Forum alongside former President Bill Clinton and former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. He debated at the Oxford Union and the Cambridge Union Society. He was not a fringe figure appearing at fringe events. He was, again and again, in the rooms where the serious conversations happened, making the case that unidentified aerial phenomena deserved serious institutional attention. He also wrote prolifically. He contributed op-eds to the New York Times, to the BBC News website, to NBC's Science platform. In a 2008 piece in the Times, he made an argument that still resonates today. Acknowledging UAPs as a subject worth investigating, he wrote, would not imply that the country has suddenly started believing in little green men. It would simply recognize the possibility that radar alone cannot always tell us what's out there. That framing, measured, non-hysterical, anchored in the language of national security rather than science fiction, was Nick Pope's signature move. He made the subject safe to discuss in serious company by refusing to make it weird. And then came 2017, and the world shifted beneath him. The New York Times published its bombshell investigation revealing that the Pentagon had been running a secret UAP program called ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. 3 videos of U.S. Navy jets encountering unidentified objects were released. Senators started talking about classified briefings. The conversation Nick Pope had been trying to start for over 2 decades suddenly became front-page news. He had been waiting for that moment for most of his adult life, and instead of crowling about it, he just kept going. He kept writing, he kept speaking, he kept showing up. In one of his final published essays, written in Skeptic magazine in February of 2026, just weeks before his death, he made a remarkable statement. He said that if the current administration ends without disclosure, he would be, quote, 99.9% convinced that there's nothing to disclose. That is not the statement of a true believer desperately clinging to faith. That is the statement of a man who spent his entire career following the evidence and was still, at the very end, following it wherever it led, even if it led somewhere he didn't want it to go. He also wrote in that same final period that ufology had come out of the fringe and into the mainstream, but that there was a real risk it could slide back, that the window was open, but not forever. He didn't live to see it close or to see it open wider, but he spent everything he had trying to make sure the right people were paying attention. I want to end with something personal. Not personal to me, but personal to Nick Pope. When he announced his diagnosis in February of 2026, he didn't write a post full of fear or anger. He was clear-eyed, the way he always was. He said he knew he couldn't beat it. He thanked his colleagues. He reflected on his years at the MOD, and then he saved his most personal words for his wife, Elizabeth. He called her a real-life Agent Scully, a scientist, a skeptic, a redhead. His counterbalance, his grounding force, and he said that she and their life together was the best part of everything that came after the government years. He called his life in full an amazing adventure. I think that's the right frame for today. Nick Pope was not a perfect figure. He operated in a field that rewards sensationalism and punishes nuance, and he occasionally found himself in uncomfortable proximity to things that were not rigorous. His critics had fair points. His legacy is complicated in the ways that all honest legacies are. But here's what I keep coming back to. He showed up. For 30 years, in book after book, in interview after interview, at conference after conference, in rooms where people laughed at him, and in rooms where he had to fight for every inch of credibility. Nick Pope showed up. He kept the door open. He kept insisting that the question was worth asking. And when the rest of the world finally started to ask it too, it was in no small part because of the foundation he had spent his life building. I say conference after conference because I was at one of them. Twice, actually. I had the honor of meeting Nick Pope in person. And I don't use the word honor lightly. I mean it in the fullest sense. standing in front of someone who had dedicated his life to a question that the world told him wasn't worth asking. Someone who showed up anyway, who kept going anyway. It does something to you. It changed the way I thought about this subject. It changed the way I thought about courage. If I'm being honest, it changed the way I think about what it means to do work that matters. Those 2 meetings stayed with me. They still do. There's the word that keeps appearing in everything written about him since his death. The word is bridge. He was a bridge between believers and skeptics, between government secrecy and public transparency, between the fringe and the mainstream, and the unexplained and the people who needed to know that someone was taking it seriously. Bridges don't get the credit that they deserve. You don't celebrate them, you celebrate where it takes you. But without the bridge, you're stuck on the wrong side of the river. Nick Pope was the bridge. Thank you for listening to this tribute episode. If his work resonates with you, I'd encourage you to pick up Open Skies, Closed Minds, or Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. Both are worth your time. And if you want to understand how far the UAP conversation has come in the last decade, spend some time with his essays and speeches. They read differently now that he's gone. They read like a man who always knew he was writing for the future. Rest well, Nick, and thank you for keeping your eyes on the sky. Hey, thanks for listening to another great episode. Be sure and like, share, or follow this podcast by leaving a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you have an experience you'd like to share, be sure and reach out to verbalecho@gmail.com. If you know someone who'd like to tell their story, please send them our way. I want to talk to them. No guardrails. Have a great week, friends. See you in the next episode.